Hello everybody. My presentation focuses on The Invisible Sex, an excerpt from Chapter 7 of Nicholas Cook's Music, a very short introduction. This section takes a more critical approach in attempting to define the boundaries of what is and isn't considered music, and also discusses some issues with gender in the music industry. For quite some time, it was common knowledge that ideology was what the other guys had. For example, capitalist democracy wasn't an ideology, it was just the way things were. It was the Russians, the other guys, who had the ideology. But an ideology is simply a system of transparent beliefs which represents itself as just the way things are. For quite some time, ideologies that present themselves as simply the way things are suppress the existence of alternative ways of thinking. So the purpose of critical theory is to expose some of the workings of these ideologies in everyday life and return power to the individual so they do not have to be confined to the ideologies surrounding them and can think and believe in what they want to. Theodor Adorno, one of the founders of critical theory, has played a large role in the emergence of critical theory within musicology. He was not only a sociologist, but also an accomplished musician. His writings have contributed significantly to the emergence of this critical viewpoint that was established by Kerman. Critical theory is a theory of power dynamics. There's groups with more power and there's groups with less power, and this unequal distribution of power results in the group with more power having biases and ideologies that are then baked into the institutions and systems that they are a part of. And it is then the critical theorist's job to expose some of these biases. The application of critical theory in musicology has led to the formation of the canon, which refers to the repertoire of masterworks on display in the Musical Museum and the role of musical institutions in constructing, maintaining, and naturalizing this canon. In short, music is a certain way just because that's the way it is, similar to the capitalist democracy example mentioned earlier. Familiarity is important when discussing what is and isn't canon. For example, a lot of the Beatles' works, such as Here Comes the Sun, can be considered canon because you can talk about it in the same way you would talk about a Franz Schubert piece, as opposed to the Rolling Stones, who are not considered canon because what's special about them is how they perform their songs as opposed to how they compose them. The early stages of a musical university education involve the student being taught to recognize things such as notes of the scale and schemes of the classical tradition. This is all part of the student being inducted into the world of Western musicianship, in which music is made up of things to hear, constructed out of notes, in the same sense that a house is constructed out of bricks. And this has two primary results. The first result is that music is transformed from being primarily something you do, but do not necessarily know how you do, to something you know, but may not necessarily do. In other words, theory is valued above practice. The second is that it becomes increasingly difficult to conceive that music might work in other ways, or to even hear it properly if it does. The harder you listen, the more you hear it in terms of notes and chords and the formal types of the Western tradition. Continuing off of that, the further one falls into the grasps of the Western viewpoint, the less one understands about music that primarily works in terms of timbre and texture. For example, it is practically impossible to look at a lot of traditional Middle Eastern music through the lens of a Western musician. What makes music natural is what you know about it. What you know about music opens your ears to some music but closes them to others. Thankfully, the music curriculum in universities has progressed since then, the aim of which is now to involve students in the creation and understanding of music, rather than initiating them into a remote and elite masterwork tradition. While Bach and Beethoven are still taught, they are taught alongside a diverse range of music from various cultures. One of Theodor Adorno's contributions to the critical viewpoint has to deal with the introduction of gender studies. As the history of music is generally told, there is a conspicuous absence of women. Now, this is not an issue dealing with a lack of women musicians, as women have always been musicians, but rather it is an issue dealing with how the history is told. Women are absent from a large part of musical history simply because they were not allowed to be a part of it. They had to deal with the pressure to conform to the social expectations of the day, which involved playing second fiddle to their husbands, both musically and in other aspects of life. They also were rarely allowed to play outside of their homes and rarely allowed to compose, and even if they did compose, they were rarely ever given credit. Because it was not socially acceptable for women to compose at the time, it was assumed that they were constitutionally or even biologically incapable of it, so the few women who did compose tended to adopt male pseudonyms to get performances. The very few women who openly composed were in a lose-lose situation, for the male reviewers of the music complained about the lack of virility and also about virility being unwomanly in itself. Things have definitely taken a turn for the better. With the emergence of 21st century superstars such as Ariana Grande, Billie Eilish, Taylor Swift, Beyonce, and a lot of others, women have certainly cemented their legacy in this era of musical history. We can only hope that when discussing it 100 years from now, that history doesn't repeat itself and women are excluded once again. Well, things have definitely been on an upward trend. Sexism is still a major problem in the music industry. Cook mentions how the popular music press is still inclined to assume that female stars do not conceive or create their own music. While this may have been relevant 20 years ago, virtually every star has writers for them nowadays, so I'm not sure how much this is an issue of gender anymore. However, women do face a multitude of other issues within the industry. The critical response is to champion the cause of women in music, but this faces a fundamental problem. Do you promote it in the mainstream or do you promote it as its own thing as women's music? Either way, it risks being overlooked. There's a third option, which is to change music at its core, which is to bring insights derived from feminism and gender studies to change what is and is not considered canon in the masterworks. My first discussion question deals with the ways that women are still being held back in the music industry. In my opinion, women are still pretty constricted in terms of subject matter when making popular music, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable for them to make music about, whereas men can pretty much just make music about anything and it will still be popular. How is the recent addition of technological technique in music, sampling, auto-tune, modeling, etc., changed the study of composition through the lens of classic theory / canon of the masterworks? Or furthermore, how has this recent advancement in music technology changed the overall curriculum of music? My third discussion question is, with people's increased access to music traditions and creative expression worldwide, has the relevancy of classic theory / the canon of masterworks eroded and become less valuable in the creative and analytic process? The short answer is yes. With the readily available array of music from around the world, people are easily able to explore other ways of thinking that is not just the traditional Western way.